Hello everybody, and welcome to Versus the Network 2023 Part 1. Part 1? What are you talking about? Are we not gonna get the full experience, I hear you shout? Well, not exactly, because now we're not doing Versus the Network for just 1 month, we're doing it for 2. Specifically April and November. Thereby giving you, the viewer, much more Versus the Network goodness. And now it's time to talk about one that I've been wanting to discuss for quite some time. In 1997, there was a show called Mission Hill that aired on the WB. It's about 4 roommates living in the Boston neighborhood of, well, Mission Hill. The main character is Andy French, who has his younger brother Kevin move in with him and turn his life upside down. The show was created by Simpsons alumni, Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein. They left The Simpsons to make this show, and they thought it was going to be a big hit. So did the WB. Sadly, due to network incompetence and overall poor management, Mission Hill barely lasted 1 season and fell into obscurity until it got a cult following years later. What happened? What caused this up-and-coming show to become one of the WB's biggest animated failures? Let me explain. Welcome to Versus the Network number 301. Okay, so this is normally where I put in the lesson of the video, like what happens when the network specifically targets you, or what happens when you and the network just aren't a good fit. But I think I'm gonna wait a little bit later to tell you what this one's lesson is. Trust me, it'll be a lot more impactful if I do. As mentioned earlier, Oakley and Weinstein left The Simpsons in order to pursue Mission Hill. Back then known as The Downtowners, but its name was changed later to avoid confusion with a similarly named show that was going to be airing on MTV. The duo said that the only reason that the WB picked the show up was because of who they were. They were connected to The Simpsons, one of the biggest shows, animated or otherwise, in television history. Clearly, they would be able to make a big hit for the network. And that's exactly what they wanted, considering that they were kind of going through some changes in demographics. With shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer becoming smash hits, the WB decided to turn its attention towards a teenage girl demographic, and hoped that Mission Hill would appeal to that crowd as well. This was not only something that Mission Hill could not do, but it was also something that its sister shows couldn't do either. These sister shows being the Oblongs, and a subject from last year's Versus the Network, Baby Blues. None of these shows were really made with teenage girls in mind, but that didn't matter to the WB. They'd already greenlit the shows, so why not keep going? You can make the round peg fit into a square hole, you just gotta jam it in hard enough. When Mission Hill debuted, it was to, okay, how do I put this? Disastrous results. The marketing campaign behind the show was atrocious. The ads were seldom seen and very poorly put together, and it really turned people off from giving the show a shot, to the point where after 2 episodes the show was pulled and ended up essentially re-premiering on the WB that summer. Yeah, the launch was so bad that they decided to try it again. And this time it wouldn't be airing alongside other shows that were supposed to appeal to a teenage girl demographic. It would air alongside shows that were trying to appeal to a minority demographic, like Jamie Foxx or The Steve Harvey Show. Not bad shows by any means, but much like the aforementioned Buffy the Vampire Slayer, this was not something that Mission Hill could blend in seamlessly with. In fact, people balked at its inclusion, considering it something that stuck out like a sore thumb. Not like people actually knew it was on, considering that around this point, all advertisement for the show was basically stopped. And the cherry on top of this crap sundae, the WB didn't even finish airing the show. Right when it reached the halfway point, premieres and reruns stopped. Nowhere to be seen. It's as if the show never came on. Similar to Baby Blues. Both shows are cases where the network tried something that wouldn't fit with their demographic, mismanaged the airing of said show, and then scrubbed it off their network pretending that it never came out. And also like Baby Blues, Mission Hill was cancelled before it was finished. I'm not talking about airing the episodes, I mean producing them. There are a few Mission Hill episodes that never got finished, though some animatics are available, but still, they're not really the same, you know? Considering how good this show is, a lot of fans would be clamoring to see these things get finished. What a shame. And yes, despite how quickly Mission Hill was cancelled, it found a fan base. Again, we're going back to some Baby Blues comparisons, but Adult Swim ended up picking up some reruns of Mission Hill, and there it finally found its audience. But by then, it was much too late. Yes, people were raving about the episodes, including the previously unseen episodes that the WB refused to air, but Mission Hill was dead, and it would stay dead forever. Until a reboot was announced many years later, of course. I'm normally super against reboots and revivals and whatever. I really want to see original stuff, and I'm so sick of old properties like Animaniacs, The Proud Family, and whatever else is out there getting brought back with nowhere near as much charm or quality as the original, and then sullying the original's reputation. But this time, I'll make an exception. We actually do need some more Mission Hill, considering that the show barely got a chance to survive and all. I'll bet you're wondering what the lesson for this video is. Is it what happens when the network is just stupid? No, that can kind of apply to basically all episodes of Versus the Network. This is something unique. This is Versus the Network number 301, What Happens When the Creators Don't Stand Up for Themselves. Oakley and Weinstein said that their biggest regret regarding Mission Hill was not fighting the network whenever they tried to pull some crap. They didn't fight back when the network aired poorly edited commercials to advertise the show. They didn't fight back when the WB pulled the show after 2 episodes for quote-unquote retooling. They didn't fight back when the show was aired alongside shows that it just didn't belong with. And they didn't fight back when the network cut the show short midway through its run. Every stupid, cruel, or poorly planned move that the WB did was made completely without protest on behalf of the creators. And this was a real missed opportunity because, remember, the WB only hired them because of their resumes. They wanted people with high credibility and an impressive resume, and that's what Oakley and Weinstein were. They could have easily slapped the network and made them see sense, but they didn't. It's a real shame because of these 3 WB animated shows, the creators of Mission Hill were the only ones that held this sort of power. The creators of the Oblongs couldn't fight back because they didn't have the star power, and the creators of Baby Blues tried to fight back and failed because the people who were actually running the show cared more about following the network's orders rather than keeping true to the source material and spirit of the original comic. Had these 2 fought back, things might have been different for Mission Hill. Granted, the damage had already been done by the time they had to pull the show after episode 2, but if they really went against the network, they could have at least finished the remaining episodes. But now, they live in regret, wondering what might have been. And so do the Mission Hill fans. Now let's answer the question that I always ask in Versus the Network, except for Versus the Network number 1. What can you, the aspiring creator, learn from all this? Well, simply put, have a spine. Be sure to fight back wherever you can. You don't have to be big celebrity producers or writers to get the job done. All you gotta do is put your foot down and let your voice be heard. Sure, the network won't always listen to you, and if they don't, then things are kind of out of your hands, but nothing is going to change if you just sit back and let all the bad stuff happen. You need to voice your displeasure and let the network know what they're doing wrong. Otherwise, you could end up just like Mission Hill, a show that was way ahead of its time, very well written, had lovable characters, and a well-developed art style, but due to network incompetence, never getting a chance, falling into obscurity, and being relegated to those top 10 underrated cartoons you totally don't remember. Number 7 will make you want to eat your own kneecaps and vomit blood lists. If this is a fate that you're fine with your show ending up in, okay, great. Go right ahead and let it happen. But if you want your show to at least go out with some dignity, or hey, even get the chance to actually succeed, then you know what you gotta do. If something like this is happening to you, just sit back and think, is this going to take me down the same path that Mission Hill went down? And if the answer is yes, it's time to throw down. When someone asks you what the worst show of all time is, there are a lot of things you could say, like My Mother the Car, or that new Scooby-Doo show that came out recently that I don't know the name of. Or if you're someone like me, you'll say Homeboys in Outer Space. And then you'll get carried out of the room by an angry mob and told never to come back. It happens. What exactly makes Homeboys in Outer Space one of the worst shows of all time? Let me put it this way. There are very few things that the human race can agree upon universally, and one of those very few things is that this was a mess. The lowest of lowbrow jokes, the easiest gags you can make, minimal plot, absolutely no character development, and aside from the acting, which is just okay at best, there's absolutely nothing of quality in this show. What if I told you, though, that this wasn't always the case? What if UPN actually had a hit on their hands, and they went out of their way to mess everything up? Well, if that hypothetical situation was true, you would get Versus the Network number 302, What Happens When the Network Tries to Fix Something That Isn't Broken? In the late 90s, UPN wanted to compete with BET and become a black-centered network. They were getting rid of a lot of their old shows and replacing them with new ones starring and or made by people of color. One of the shows that was going to kick all this off was Homeboys in Outer Space. It was about two slackers who live on a really dumpy spaceship traveling around the galaxy looking for odd jobs, hoping that one day they'll make it big. One of the main people on this show was Simpsons alumni, Mike Reiss. He was one of the two showrunners on The Simpsons during its time where it finally found its footing and became one of the funniest shows in TV history. So the fact that he was on board obviously meant that Homeboys in Outer Space was gonna be great. And after a lengthy process of putting together a script and a crew, it looked pretty good. The jokes were funny, the dialogue was snappy, and the characters, while not fully developed yet, had distinct personalities and had room to grow. UPN took one look at this and went, no, this is not gonna work. We need to make it dumber. So they brought in these new consultants and writers and absolutely butchered the pilot's script. And it was this version of the show, not the good one headed by Mike Reiss, that ended up debuting on UPN and is now often regarded as one of the worst shows of all time. Why did they do this? They had a great show all ready to go, but then they decided to make it terrible? Well, there are a couple theories I have. None of them have that much evidence to go off of, but knowing UPN, I've kind of figured out some of their patterns, and I've come to 3 possible conclusions, each one worse than the last. Option number 1, bad market data. UPN wasn't exactly doing the best at this time. Yeah, it had a couple hits under its belt, but they weren't enough to compete with the major players like Fox or NBC. So they could have tried to tamper with the show to make it, quote-unquote, the perfect show, so that it was too big and too good to fail. Little did they realize, they really needed to make sure that the show was funny before they aired it. UPN has a bad record when it comes to fully embracing bad projects, like The Secret Diary of Desmond Pfeiffer. The P isn't silent, that's the joke. Ha 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 ha! It was a Civil War comedy that was so offensive, at the time, that its first episode was never aired. And despite being billed as one of the network's future biggest hits, it, much like Homeboys in Outer Space, is now considered a stain on television, and if it's remembered at all, it's not in any kind of positive way. Option number 2, saving money. Good writers cost a lot. That makes sense, you get what you pay for. It's like going down to the store and going, should I get these Nikes or these mics? Tough one. Well, the mics are cheaper, so I'll go with those. And then you get all angry when they fall apart on your walk back home. That's one of the ways I see Homeboys in Outer Space's production going down. UPN cheaped out and got some worse writers, and as a result, the writing became unbearable and the show would never become a hit. But by then, it was already too late. UPN had invested so much into this crew that they couldn't let them go and start over. That would be a total waste of money. So they decided to bite the bullet and make Homeboys in Outer Space anyways, and then endure the consequences. And if this is true, that would mean that Homeboys in Outer Space was destroyed purely because they wanted to save a few $100s. Isn't that just great? And the third reason, and honestly the most likely one in my opinion, Remember what I said that the new writers did to Homeboys in Outer Space? They made it dumber. Less snappy, less fun, less clever, less developed, less everything. The whole show could be mentally processed within seconds after watching the episode, and then immediately you'd forget all about it because, to be honest, there was nothing to it. With the original being described by Mike Reiss as an intelligent comedy, it almost seems like UPN wanted to dumb it down because it thought that its new audience wouldn't be smart enough to understand what was going on in the show. Yeah, that's not good at all. I really hope this one isn't true, but honestly, it's the one that makes the most sense. They saw a script that objectively worked. It had some really smart people behind it. Why would they destroy it? And if any of you out there are saying, a network wouldn't destroy a show because it's too smart, well then let me tell you about this little show known as Police Squad. For those of you who haven't heard of this is the show that Naked Gun was based on. Yeah, Naked Gun is an adaptation of a TV show. This is one of the funniest shows I have ever seen. It's Naked Gun but shorter and admittedly with a smaller budget. ABC has gone on record saying that the reason they canceled it was because it required the audience to think. They thought that little of their viewers. Isn't that just disgusting? And if a major network like ABC would do this, who's to say UPN wouldn't as well? Regardless of the motive, the fact of the matter is that Homeboys in Outer Space could have really been something good. But for whatever reason, UPN decided to take a hatchet to it, and now it's this. So what can you, the aspiring creator, do to prevent this? All you can really do is protest, but even then, that probably won't do anything. So, if I'm being honest, if this happens to you, you're kind of screwed. If you really can't convince these executives who have a clear vision of destruction for your property, then sorry, you're out of luck. Although, you could cite Homeboys in Outer Space as an example of network interference that destroyed what could have been a giant hit. And maybe, just maybe, those network executives will learn from history and choose not to repeat it. That's right, you read the title, and yes, we're absolutely doing this again, so let's get going. Back during Versus the Network 2021, I talked about how Nickelodeon is essentially the worst place to pitch a show, especially if that show just so happens to be animated. Simply put, Nickelodeon has it out for any Nicktoon that it has that's not an immediate success. It keeps forgetting that in order for things to be successful and to have a big fan base, it needs time to register with the public. This isn't even exclusive to brand new shows either. So many shows got screwed over by Nickelodeon purely because they lost interest. In the last video, I mentioned that the only way to be safe from Nickelodeon's wrath is to be a phenomenon, but I'd actually like to amend that statement to be this. In order to escape Nickelodeon's wrath, you have to be a phenomenon. And then when you are, they'll smother you and kill you slowly and painfully. That's right, we're going in the opposite direction here. Let me introduce you to Versus the Network number 303. What happens when the network doesn't know how to manage its successes? I'm gonna start by saying one word. SpongeBob.
Hey, Squidward!
Yeah, we all knew this one was coming, so let's just get it out of the way, shall we? SpongeBob is everywhere. You can't really escape him no matter how hard you try. Honestly, it's gotten to the point where I bet even the Amish can't get rid of him. SpongeBob started off in 1999, and through its first 3 seasons, it not only was a marketing powerhouse, but it also smashed in the viewership. Even the reruns got really high ratings.
You wanna see me do it again?
That's because the show appealed to not just kids, but adults as well. There are stories about college students and professors alike discussing the new episodes of SpongeBob and laughing their heads off. With a show that bridged the generational gap this well, obviously Nickelodeon wasn't ready to say goodbye, even when the creator was. Steven Hillenburg, despite everything he tried, was not able to end the show with a sponge who could fly. Nor was he able to do so with the theatrically released movie from 2004. Hillenburg decided to step aside as the lead creator of the show, causing SpongeBob to fall into less than capable hands, slowly but surely the show fell apart. Episodes like Life of Crime, Sailor Mouth, Chocolate with Nuts, or The Algae's Always Greener were no longer the norm. Instead, we got things that were either boring, disturbing, annoying, or some kind of combination of the three.
Why do you keep moving it?
Cause you keep saying
Nickelodeon kept upping the episode order again and again with each passing season. And it really showed that the writers were running out of ideas very quickly. Not only were episodes rehashing old ones and making them significantly worse, but many times the episodes just wouldn't go anywhere and nothing would happen. It would just be SpongeBob and Patrick derping around and annoying Squidward, or yet another generic plan that Plankton has to steal the Krabby Patty, and you get where I'm going from this, don't you? They churned out a couple more movies that didn't really win people over, and the show kept getting worse and worse. But then, some new writers got hired and changed the show. I won't necessarily say for the better, because these new seasons are pretty divisive. Some out there say that the new animation and constant callbacks to old episodes are really fun. Others, like myself, find the show to be really annoying now given how much louder it is and how overly expressive the animation is, and that meta humor just hurts. But regardless of how you feel about the new SpongeBob seasons, you can't deny that this is not the same show that it used to be back in the day. It's something else. And that's kind of what Nickelodeon wanted, so that way, it could stand out from all the spin-offs. Yep, not only have we gotten a bunch of movies and additional episodes, but there's also more SpongeBob shows out there while the original's still going. We've got Camp Coral, that Patrick Star abomination, and apparently that Squidward's back gag they did a few years ago. That's gonna be a real thing. Squidward's actually gonna get his own show. What's next? Are we gonna get the Gary Show? Are these shows of any quality? Nope. But that's okay, because they have the SpongeBob name and branding on it, so it will automatically be a big success. And that's all Nickelodeon cares about. If you're not convinced, then take a look at what's happening to the Loud House. Full disclosure, I hadn't gone back to watch the Loud House since I first reviewed it back in 2019. And wow, when I went back to take a look at the show, I was amazed. This is so different. And I'm not even just talking about the time skip. Yeah, I know the time skip's kind of controversial, but you know what? I kind of like it. It's kind of nice to see some continuity and development with the timeline, even if they don't necessarily do many good things with it. But that's the least of our problems. Remember how back in the old Loud House video I said that the thing that made the show special was its down-to-earth tone and lovable characters? Well, it's a good thing those older episodes are still here to remind us of what used to be. Otherwise, we might forget what made the show so great. Yep, everything that made the original so good is now gone. Everything's so much more fantastical and over the top, and not to mention gross.
it's good luck for the team.
The characters are flanderized, we're getting less focus on the family. Basically, take everything that made the original season stand out and flip it upside down. And much like SpongeBob, Nickelodeon doesn't see the Loud House as a show, it sees it as a money-making franchise first and foremost, which is evident when you look at the Casa Grandes, the real Loud House, the Loud House movie, and all these wild marketing stunts they've pulled in recent times.
If that happens, Spectrum customers won't get to see my sisters and me in new episodes of the Loud House.
Just want to say, I called it. I knew this was gonna happen, and I told you all, remember? They tend to never, ever let it go until the show is dead and buried. Not only did it happen, but it ended up way worse than I thought. According to a lot of the Loud House fans I've been talking to, the show is just a mess. And that's clearly because Nickelodeon doesn't really care about the quality. All they care about is the show maintaining its relevance, so that way they can keep pushing out more merchandise and spin-offs and video games and really whatever else the Loud House can be slapped onto. Now, before you go into the comments and start typing, we need some new leadership at Nickelodeon. These current people have got to go. Let me tell you something. This has been a problem at Nickelodeon since day one. I can't really talk about this myself since I'm not really an expert on the show, so let's bring back former channel owner Billy HL.
I'm back.
To tell you about how Nickelodeon treated the Rugrats.
Once upon a time, animator Gabor Chupo and his then wife Arlene Klasky formed Klasky Chupo. I'm not going to bore you with the immense details of their work for the sake of this video, as you're probably aware of what they do anyways, but the studio was doing freelance work developing many music videos, commercials, and short films during the 1980s, most notable these being the early Simpsons. However, they wound up pitching to Nickelodeon, who was on the lookout for new animated content for their 1990s lineup. The pitch they chose to present was the short film Tommy and the Great White Thing, about a baby named Tommy Pickles and his misadventures confronting a toilet. Riveting, I know. It was picked up as a series along with Doug and Ren and Stimpy, and while it was a decent hit lasting for 3 seasons, it paled in success compared to the monster that was Ren and Stimpy. Because of this, production ended up halting in 1993, so the studio could develop their next animated series, Real Monsters. The next couple of years would see unaired Rugrats episodes be released sporadically, along with reruns of the older episodes. However, through these reruns and the overwhelming success of the Jewish-themed specials, A Rugrats Passover and A Rugrats Hanukkah, the series would see its first spike in massive viewership. Not wanting to ignore the newfound success, Nickelodeon and Klasky Csupo put the series back into production in 1996, further cementing the property as a pop culture phenomenon. More seasons were being ordered, merchandise flew off the shelves, and even spawned a major animated feature film that became a blockbuster hit. This only led to more show renewals, shoddy products, new characters, theme park tie-ins, and a couple more movies. However, this caused a major quality dip, with the series straying further away from any sense of wonder or decent storytelling, and instead decided to place more emphasis on gross-out gags and obnoxious dialogue. It didn't matter though. Nickelodeon wanted this thing to keep on going because it was still making them a crap ton of money. If it means sacrificing the quality and integrity of the brand, they'll keep this machine up and running. And this would lead to the show losing its audience thanks to oversaturation and the arrival of another Nicktoon that stole its thunder in popularity. But the fuckheads at Nickelodeon were very much prepared for this event, as when Rugrats was unceremoniously canned, they greenlit an expansion on the one-off special All Grown Up, called All Grown Up. This artificially lengthened the brand's run, now appealing to the cool, rowdy tween market. Okay. The show lasted for 5 seasons, wait, what? But failed to leave a lasting impression and only irritated casuals and old fans for how Nick just wouldn't let this brand die. Thankfully, Nick would eventually pull the plug in 2008, but would sadly cut ties with Klasky Csupo around the same time because they were tired of their art style. Very depressing of them to dispose a nearly 2-decade-long partnership like that, but I guess it just shows how much the network truly feels towards their fellow collaborators. But Nickelodeon tried very hard to find a new use of this IP for over a decade, with many failed attempts at new spin-offs like the Preschool Days spin-off that went nowhere, and a canned live-action animation hybrid film that sounded less than promising. Although as of this recording, they're still kind of thinking about making it. Eventually a CGI reboot was officially picked up, and as of this recording, will release its 2nd season in April 2023. Just goes to show how much Nick is still willing to latch onto a stale franchise for an extra buck. And it seems like people are viewing it so, hey, they're gonna keep going while the iron's still hot. Only time will tell when this franchise will once again find itself burning out and disappearing from the face of the earth.
Thanks, Billy. Always nice to have you back. Anyways, what's the point of this video, I hear you asking? That's right, I can hear you. You think you're alone, but you're not. Well, firstly, did you notice the timeline of when Rugrats started to falter? That's right, in the 2000s. And that's where SpongeBob was starting to make a splash. So once Nickelodeon found something else that was a big hit, and in fact something that was actually a bigger hit than Rugrats, especially since the show was starting to lose popularity, they decided to ditch Rugrats in favor of the Sponge. And if you notice, they didn't do the same thing to SpongeBob when the Loud House came out. No. They clung to both shows for dear life, as if letting go of one of them would mean their certain death. To be fair, they're actually right. The reason why they're clinging so hard to SpongeBob SquarePants and the Loud House is because they have nothing else, and they have nobody to blame but themselves. Nickelodeon has had so many chances to have big, successful Nicktoons, but they won't let the shows grow beyond 1 or 2 seasons, and then cut them loose. Any one of these, like El Tigre, Cat Scratch, Tough Puppy, Harvey Beaks, they could have been huge, but we'll never know because they never really got a fair shot. In the last video, I talked about how the other Nicktoons are essentially filler. They're mostly there to attract advertisers and to make the network look good, which is true, but also this comes at a terrible price. Now that they only have SpongeBob and the Loud House, they've got no choice but to keep running them into the ground. If I'm being honest, if they don't keep making things with their labels on them, they're going to die. When the Loud House came on and was an immediate success, Nickelodeon thought that they struck gold. Finally, something else that can keep them afloat. Because keep in mind, before The Loud House came out, Nickelodeon was in big trouble. Just a couple years ago, they saw a 30% ratings decline, and not once until The Loud House came back did they see any sort of rebound. And yes, this is because cable was dying around that point, though nowhere near as much as it is now, but it's also because of the way Nickelodeon was running its programming. And then bam, something comes along that's gonna turn everything around, but then they don't learn from their mistakes. And that's why I can't feel bad for them. They did this to themselves. Not only that, but they keep doing it again and again. What they've forgotten is that SpongeBob, their biggest hit in history, wasn't some kind of mega hit right off the bat. Last week, we talked about a lot of instances where Nickelodeon, let's just say, wasn't exactly the nicest to its shows. Whether it be SpongeBob SquarePants, Rugrats, or The Loud House, even when shows are successful, they always try to kill them one way or another. Heck, that's actually the subject of our most popular Versus the Network video, Nicktoons vs. the Network Part 1. But what if I told you Nickelodeon didn't always win? What if one time they tried to screw a show over because of SpongeBob, they ended up getting bit back really hard? That's the case with the subject of today's video, Back at the Barnyard, which is a lot of things. It's chaotic, it's loud, it's wild, it's Family Guy for kids, and most importantly, it's the best case of revenge against a network that I have ever seen. I'm sure there's gonna be a lot of comments telling me about this show or that show that did it even better, but if that's true, then please tell me. I'd love to hear more stories like this. If more people fought against the network and their garbage, then the world would be a better place, am I right? But that's not what this video's about. It's about Versus the Network number 304, what happens when the show fights back. Following the success of 2006's Barnyard, the original Party Animals, Nickelodeon greenlit a show based on the movie called Back at the Barnyard, which would basically, for all intents and purposes, be its own thing. Some characters were removed, some characters were replaced, most events from the movie were completely ignored, and most importantly, its entire style and structure would change. Gone were times where they could have sit-down, serious talks and character growth. It was all about jokes, and even more jokes. To be fair though, a lot of these jokes were actually pretty funny. I mean, come on. Viewer mail? Everyone loves viewer mail. Or how's about the papaya joke? It's just so stupid, but it makes me laugh every time. Or the entire episode of The Chronicles of Barnyard. That is like the best Barnyard thing ever. At first, the network seemed to appreciate the show. It got constant reruns and massive amounts of promotion, even to the point where it got a little bit old. And some people who didn't like the show, most notably classic era Pie Guy Rules,
Oh, that show's still on. Oh, I don't like Back at the Barnyard.
were not too happy with the show that they didn't really like getting massive amounts of attention, sometimes even as much as something like the Fairly Odd Parents or the Penguins of Madagascar. For the most part though, people were really responding well to the show, but then Nickelodeon got cold feet. We still don't really know why, but come on, it's Nickelodeon, we can definitely guess. It's all about that little fella that lives in a pineapple under the sea. SpongeBob ruins everything! Since ratings weren't exactly matching SpongeBob's high standard that was just about impossible to beat, Nickelodeon told the crew, sorry guys, you get one more season, don't you worry, but after that, we're calling it quits. So what did the people behind Back at the Barnyard do? Did they do what most Nicktoons creators did and just take it because they knew they couldn't do anything to stop it? Nope. Did they do what the creators of Harvey Beaks did and tell everybody their story and then get blacklisted from the industry for a brief period? Nope. What they did was they decided to make their last season not necessarily their best, but their most extreme. Whatever standards they had, whatever boundaries were previously in place, were all gone. See, there was a method to the madness in the original Back at the Barnyard. It could be loud, it could be crazy, but it still had to have some grounding and some restraint. It couldn't be constant madness upon lunacy upon insanity. But then, when Nickelodeon said that there wouldn't be any more episodes after season 2, suddenly, whatever you wanted to put in the show would be just fine. You want massive amounts of cutaway jokes to the point where it would make Family Guy blush? Yeah, sure, go right ahead. Do you want jokes that can stretch up to a minute's worth of time? Yeah, fine, put it in the episode. Do you want an episode where the narrator constantly interrupts what's going on so that he can explain his Back at the Barnyard fanfiction? If you conceive it, you can achieve it. Characterization was never really the focus of Back at the Barnyard, but at least for the most part in season 1, they were relatively consistent. Not consistent with the movie, of course, consistent with the Back at the Barnyard world, which is basically, like I said before, its own thing. In season 2, however, characterization was almost non-existent. Though, unlike when Drawn Together did that after its seasonal rot, this time it was fully on purpose, not just because the people behind the scenes didn't know what they were doing. Those working on Back at the Barnyard felt, well, the show's not gonna get renewed anyways. It really doesn't matter if we tick the network off or upset advertisers. If the censor board will allow it, then it's going in the episode, no questions asked. But then that begs the question, if this is the stuff that made it in, what stuff didn't make it in? How can you top Bionic Janitor, or Pig turning into the Hulk, or an entire episode that's dedicated to making fun of Dr. Phil? Well, thanks to Chris Hardwick and Rob Paulson, who played Otis and Peck respectively, we know exactly what didn't make it in. Because they knew that Nickelodeon couldn't touch them no matter what, a lot of recording sessions were filled with, let's just call it not exactly Nickelodeon-friendly material. There would be constant ad-libs involving swearing, sexual innuendo, outright sexual acts or statements, or violence. It seems like the Christmas episode's recording was the worst. Here's what they had to say about it.
And so a week later, we were recording, and it had just gone off the rails. Yeah. And for some reason, I imagine it was my fault, we were all singing a chorus of the following song. Dick tits, da-na-na-da-na-na-da, dick tits, da-na-na-da-na-na-da, D-I-C-K-T-I-T-S, dick tits, da. So we were singing this in a round.
I'm so sorry, Mom.
And so,
so sorry.
And so we're singing this, the same head, one of the heads of the network pokes his head in. We're singing, the entire cast is singing Dick Tits, and Jed Spingarn, one of the producers, goes, "Oh, hey, Roland, what are you going to do, cancel us some more?" And he slowly just closed the door and backed out.
Bravo! Well done. I can't tell you how happy I am that someone has finally made a mockery out of Nickelodeon like this. Sure, people have parodied them on the outside and have called them out on their crap, but with this level of a take that attitude from within Nickelodeon itself, this is something special. Though I will say, Nickelodeon didn't exactly take this lying down. They tried to fight back, but by then, it was already too late. Back at the Barnyard didn't get to air all of season 2 on Nickelodeon itself. Nickelodeon decided to do what it always does with shows it hates. It put all the remaining episodes of Back at the Barnyard on to its sister channel, you know, the same one that was viewed by less than half of its main audience, Nicktoons Network. While this was a great network back in its day, it's also where shows went to die. So really, everybody won. Nickelodeon got to scrub its hands of that awful, cursed show that couldn't live up to SpongeBob, and the people behind Back at the Barnyard got to let loose for a while and make whatever they wanted. Now that I think of it, maybe this is why Nickelodeon had a really tight grip on their shows in the 2010s. It's a thought. Who knows? Normally, this would be the part of Versus the Network where I would ask you, the aspiring creator, what you would do to prevent this, but I don't really think that fits here, especially since the only thing you'd want to prevent is network interference and apathy, so yeah, we've already answered that in Nicktoons Versus the Network Part 1. So what can you, the aspiring creator, do to keep this going? Well, simply put, don't take the network abuse lightly. If you've got a comedic show and you really want to screw it to them, go right ahead. Do it. If your show's more character-focused or dramatic, or, hey, a more grounded comedy than Back of the Barnyard was, you can find ways to really annoy the network and make them pay for what they did, putting in dark and suggestive themes for one, and there's also amping up the insanity of the humor or just what kind of jokes you tell. You know, the things that would normally get your show reprimanded, but it doesn't matter anymore. If you're scared to do this, though, and you're worried that it might hurt your show, two things. One, if you're still in charge and you've still got creative control, you can still do this in a way that keeps the show's integrity, but at the same time, you can also add in things that the network wouldn't like. What exactly that is would depend on the network you're on, but if it's Disney, they basically hate everything, and that means that you've got a wide arsenal at your disposal. And secondly, I'll leave you with the words that we heard earlier that I think should be said in the industry way more often.
Oh, hey, Roland, what are you gonna do? Cancel us some more?
Alright, you want a nasty story to finish out Versus the Network 2023 Part 1? Well, I've got you covered. The Tick, created by Ben Edlund, was a comedic comic book series about a vulnerable superhero who protects the city known as The City with his loyal but nerdy and wimpy sidekick, Arthur. The series was popular enough to get an animated adaptation on Fox Kids, but as time would go on, it would prove to not be enough. The Tick had to come back to TV, and sure enough he did. And in doing so, he gave us Versus the Network number 305, What Happens When the Network Plays the Long Game. The Tick's live-action adaptation would prove to be very different than its animated counterpart. It would be closer in tone to the comics, but also generally toned down. Being pitched as Seinfeld in tights, The Tick 2001, as we're gonna call it from here on out, aimed to be more of a sitcom rather than a traditional superhero/action comedy show. The series took a year and a half of development time, but eventually Fox picked it up. And that's when everything got bad. Fox never cared about The Tick. Oh sure, they pretended to care, and they made a big effort shilling out its ad space to advertisers, but there was one fatal flaw that The Tick 2001 had that Fox could not get over. You wanna know what it is? It's the fact that Fox didn't own the series. It was TriStar. Whatever happened with the show, whatever big success it could end up being, all the credit would have to go to them. Fox was just the network that was gonna put it on. While yes, they would get a large portion of the revenue it created, they wanted that full control, the full ownership that would make them that much richer. From the looks of it, it seems like Fox laid out this master plan spanning over the entire production to make sure that The Tick failed. First of all, Fox didn't give the series nearly enough money to do what it wanted. Given its heavy reliance on sets, detailed props, and special effects, The Tick would need more funding than your traditional sitcom, but Fox wouldn't really budge. They got a little more, but not enough to make it a smooth production. It took ages to produce all 9 episodes because the production frequently shut down. There wasn't enough money to keep things going, so it was a struggle to even make these things happen. But lo and behold, they did, and the crew was very proud of what they've done. Then Fox decided to congratulate them by giving them some heavy promotion during the World Series. While at first the World Series would be like a good place to advertise things, it also seems to be where Fox advertises some of their, how do I put this, riskier projects, let's just say. Like, oh, I don't know, Alan Gregory for one. Those who saw these advertisements noticed the time that it would be coming on. It would be airing in prime time. Sure, sitcoms were known to air in prime time and find some decent success, but many Hollywood insiders found this kind of strange, considering that this niche and experimental show would have some very stiff competition, most notably Survivor and CSI. The Tick may be nigh invulnerable, but not even he can survive a ratings beatdown like that, which means that it would be totally fine to use this as a justification to get The Tick 2001 cancelled. Except that didn't really happen, and Fox didn't expect it to either. The Tick found a small, albeit loyal fanbase, and was overall a modest success. This is exactly what Fox wanted. All of these advertisements they put in place made the show a hit. They had a good reputation amongst advertisers now, so it was time to pull out.
What?
All promotion for the show basically stopped. You could watch this network for hours on end and have no idea that The Tick 2001 was on, or even existed if you didn't know any better. And wouldn't you know it, as soon as the advertisement stopped, the viewership declined, which means that Fox had enough reason to cancel the show. Judging by appearances, they did everything right. They gave the show enough money to produce the episodes, they aired a bunch of advertisements for the big premiere, and they kept the show on the air long enough to air all 9 episodes, even though they made the official cancellation announcement after the airing of episode 8. And I mean right after, as in the episode was barely done by the time the announcement was made, but that doesn't matter, the network is always right. It was the show's fault for not finding an audience. It was too expensive, too niche, and it wasn't owned by Fox. It goes without saying that this is a recipe for disaster, but to the cast and crew's credit, they didn't go quietly into the night. They were very outspoken about the way Fox treated the show, especially 2 actors in particular. Nestor Carbonell, who played Batman well, and Patrick Warburton, who played the title character. Both of them repeatedly and loudly shared their experience on the show, and they told the story that I just told you. They also noted that Fox used the really lame excuse of production costs to cancel the show. Normally, this is a justifiable excuse. As I say many times and will continue to say many times in the future, shows have to make a profit in order to stay on the air. But this argument falls apart for 2 reasons. 1, the show never really got the proper funding it needed anyways, and 2, Fox was part of the reason that it was more expensive. Because Fox didn't give them enough time to produce the episodes, the cast and crew had to scramble to meet their deadline, which of course means overtime pay. That was their main justification for killing off The Tick 2001, and it was all Fox's fault. The way that Fox was so willing to play out the long game to make sure that The Tick died is unbelievable. Here on Versus the Network, we have seen a lot of instances of networks trying to sabotage a show, most notably with The Weird Al Show, but even CBS knew how to do it right. Granted, knowing how to kill a show unfairly is not a good thing to know, but still they did. When they targeted The Weird Al Show and tried to make it fail, they made sure to invest as few resources as possible. Again, like The Tick 2001, Weird Al got a pretty decent budget, but it also never went all that high. The Tick, despite not getting the money that it needed, still got quite a lot. Way more than something like The Weird Al Show. Also, The Tick got a very expensive ad campaign during the World Series, while The Weird Al Show got next to nothing. And of course, The Weird Al Show bombed right off the bat, so CBS didn't really have to put that much effort into screwing it over, partially because CBS Kids was kind of dying at that point. But The Tick 2001 started off as a hit and then became a bomb, meaning that Fox had to put some extra effort into making a failure. And that right there is the craziest part. They could have had a hit. The show was finding an audience right after episode 1. Very, very rarely does that ever happen. Fox could have still gotten a decent chunk of money from the show, but they wanted it all. And if they couldn't have it all, then they would make sure that there was nothing to argue over at all. It's a shame that the Tick 2001 came out in, well, 2001, because if something like this happened today, we all would hear about it, and the network would look really bad. And since they want their reputation to be as pristine as possible to attract those advertising dollars, they would rectify the situation at once. But no, sadly, back in the prehistoric year of 2001, we didn't really have things like social media or tell-all blogs, so the Tick had to succumb to the mistreatment of Fox. But how can you, the aspiring creator, learn from this? All I can really tell you is, look out for the signs. If you see history start to repeat itself, and you notice that your network or streaming company or whatever is starting to do all of this to you, let their mistreatment be known. You probably have a loyal fan base, or at least people that are looking on curiously, that'll run with your story and let everyone know what's really going on. The only way to beat the network in this case is to tell their evil plan to the world. They'll be just fine with doing this behind closed doors, but the second word gets out, suddenly it's all a misunderstanding, and there was never any ill will. We're all friends here. Happy, successful, money-making friends. If you learn anything from this video, it should be that even something as invincible as the Tick is still weak to network interference. And before we go on to the outro, it's time for a Media Mementos fan art shoutout. Take a look at this. This comes courtesy of Lennon Dash, and when I saw this, honestly, it blew me away. The attention to detail here is phenomenal. There's me with my VHS tape, there's V over there, Billy with his puppet friend. Surrounding us, we have some of the more famous, or I guess, from my perspective, some of the most liked media I've covered. There's the other father from Coraline, Dave the Barbarian from Take a Wild Guess, Oral from Moral Oral, Lucky from Whacked, Dan from Dan Versus, Celeste from Danganronpa, George the Volcano from the Volva commercials, and Captain Hero from Drawn Together. I hope you guys know that I save all the fan art you guys send me and I have it in a little file so I can look at it whenever I feel down. And it's stuff like this that never fails to lift my spirit. Thank you so much, Lennon Dash. I love it. Also, I'd like to give a quick shout out to Bailey Maloney. As promised, I would give a shout out to whoever figured out what all 5 Versus the Network videos would be, and Bailey did it. Congratulations! Everybody give Bailey a round of applause, or else. I told you Versus the Network 2023 wasn't over yet, but you didn't believe me! We're starting round 2 of Versus the Network 2023 with an old story, but one that's just as relevant, if not more relevant today. I was going through my archive, as I often do, and I came across shelf number 226 from Southampton, Massachusetts. On it were a bunch of FX reruns of this little show called The Greatest American Hero. I quickly discovered that it was a fun show with lovable characters, witty writing, and some decent special effects for 1980s TV. And as I often do when I find a show I like, I decide to do a little bit of digging into its past. And as soon as I did, I realized that it was the perfect choice for Versus the Network number 305. What happens when the network greenlights a show they don't like? The Greatest American Hero was created by TV legend Stephen J. Cannell. He's most known for his work on stuff like 21 Jump Street, The A-Team, and The Rockford Files. This man seemed to be a hit machine. Every time he'd come up with a new idea, it would be something that either would get a cult fan base, or would be a multinational phenomenon. His latest idea, The Greatest American Hero, was about a public school teacher named Ralph Hinckley. One day, out on a class field trip, Hinckley would be visited by aliens and would be given an all-powerful super suit. However, he lost the instructions that came with it, so now it's up to him to save the day, all without having a firm grasp on what he can do. Now, to be clear, when I say that Ralph would save the day, he would do so by fighting ordinary issues that you and I would face every day. The most extreme of these would probably be something like a bank robbery or a purse snatcher, not anything that's superhuman or out of the norm. The weirdest this show was supposed to get was the alien encounter that started this off. ABC enthusiastically greenlit the show, but unknown to Cannell, they weren't too happy with what they heard. They liked the basic concept of a guy with superpowers that he doesn't understand, but they wanted to take that character and concept and turn it into their own invention and exploit it as much as possible. As soon as production began, ABC flooded the crew with all these notes on how they wanted to retool the show, most notably in changing the style. Instead of having the greatest American hero fight the greatest American problems, he would become an overly dedicated special education teacher moonlighting as a hero on the side, who would fight things like monsters or terrorist attacks, thereby going against the main vision that its creator had in mind. Cannell wasn't all too thrilled with this, but by this point, he knew how showbiz worked. He knew that when you pitch a show, it usually doesn't stay the same way from the beginning all the way to the premiere. Eventually, a deal was met that Ralph would fight big, extraordinary things, but they would be more realistic than what ABC wanted. Though it is worth noting that as the show went on, the villainous force of the week would start to get stranger and stranger. The plots went from Ralph having to protect an FBI informant, to Ralph having to save his FBI agent friend from a mad scientist who runs this pseudo-cult in the middle of nowhere, who wants to perform experiments on him because he just thinks that the agent is awesome. I mean, I'm not gonna knock the episode, I thought it was a lot of fun, but it was definitely a strange choice. It's also widely believed that ABC wanted The Greatest American Hero to be a comedy. The show did have some comedic elements. Ralph's a little bit of a klutz, especially when he puts his suit on. His FBI agent friend has his dim-witted moments. But the main strength of the show is not the humor, not the action, but the characters themselves. They grow, they change, they have multiple layers. Everything else in the show is meant to enhance them. They're what's supposed to keep the audience coming back every week. ABC didn't feel the same way. They had other plans for The Greatest American Hero, ones that didn't exactly work out. Despite the fact that its creator made it very clear that he wanted The Greatest American Hero to be a lighthearted character-based drama, and in fact that is what the episodes were made as, ABC decided to market the show as if they got their way from the beginning. When you would watch ABC in 1981, you would come across an ad for The Greatest American Hero, which is, apparently, all about a hapless, bumbling oaf who just so happens to get superpowers, and while he keeps messing things up, golly gee, he's trying his best. And it never stopped. From the beginning of the show's life all the way to its untimely end, ABC would only market it as a screwball comedy. The comedic elements were blown way out of proportion, the action was kept at a minimum, and the character moments were practically ignored. That means that in 1981 or 1982, when you would see an ad for the show and get excited for what it promises, you would tune in and be disappointed because, in a sense, it was false advertising. Nevertheless, the show was able to persevere for 2 good seasons, and it managed to do something that few other shows in history have been able to do: get its theme song on the Billboard charts. To this day, the theme song is more well known than the show itself. And for good reason, because that thing is great. And while the show was starting to get progressively more surreal, ABC wasn't happy with the direction the show was taking, or rather, was holding to with an iron grip. So they decided to take the coward's way out by canceling the show as quickly as possible, though they decided to cover their tracks. While the show wasn't doing spectacularly, it was doing well enough to stay afloat, and it had a cult following to match. So if ABC decided to cancel The Greatest American Hero out of the blue, people would get mad. As a result, ABC decided to shift The Greatest American Hero to a Friday night death slot where no one would be watching. Only a couple episodes of the new 3rd season managed to air in 1983, and wouldn't you know it, putting the show on when no one was watching made the ratings dip. And as soon as it happened, ABC pulled the plug. This resulted in several episodes being unaired, and they would never be seen until the show was thrusted into syndication. I guess if The Greatest American Hero couldn't be a comedy, then it couldn't be anything at all. There have been numerous attempts to revive the show since, but but they've never worked out and have all fizzled out after just one episode each. Then again, we wouldn't have needed those revivals if ABC decided to just be cool and let the show be what it wanted. It's a lot like when Weird Al Yankovic pitched the Weird Al Show. The network was looking for one thing in particular and wouldn't accept anything else. Only in that case, Al lied to sell the show. This time around, the creator was fully upfront with what he wanted, and the network put the show into production with the sole intent of changing it into their vision instead. This begs the question, if you hate a show's concept, if you don't approve of its tone, and you think that its goals are out of line, why would you agree to make it at all? Simply put, I think that ABC believed that they knew better than Cannell. I think they saw a great concept for a comedy here, and this guy who's made a few big hits here and there, he doesn't know what he's talking about. We are executives. We run the networks, obviously. We're the go-to authorities for what people want to watch. And it's crazy to me that when they didn't get their way, they pretended that they did, thereby ensuring that the show would never take off. No pun intended, given the famous flying scenes where Ralph struggles. Anyways, at that point, it would have been wise to just be honest with the audience and tell them what the show really was. Only then could it be a success. And that there proves that once ABC didn't get their way, they stopped caring about the greatest American hero. Otherwise, they would have advertised the show correctly, they wouldn't have put it in the Friday night death slot, and they would have aired the entire third season instead of just cutting it in half. Thankfully, this whole fiasco didn't hurt Cannell's career, and he would go on to make several other hit shows. Like I mentioned, he is the guy who made the A-Team after all. And ABC, well, yeah, they're still ABC, so nobody really got hurt in the end. The only victim here was the show itself, or I guess since with all those pilots out there now, it's a franchise? Now, I'm not gonna say that the greatest American hero is one of the greatest things ever, but it's a solid show overall, and as far as I can tell, no major misses in all 3 seasons. If you're looking for an old show to get into, and one that had a lot of potential that didn't get to be fully realized, I'd say check it out. And of course, if you are an aspiring creator who's looking to pitch a show to a streaming service or a TV network, you gotta be careful. While you can't always be too picky with who picks your show up, you've still gotta make sure that they do indeed want your show. Remember what happened with Baby Blues, where they picked the show up just for the name, and then completely severed all ties from the source material? Yeah, it even happened back then with original properties, as seen here. And it's still happening to this day. Remember Powerless? Of course you don't. And the network is why. Or I guess in this case, production studio. The point still stands. You gotta be careful. You gotta make sure their intentions are pure. If they think you have a great concept and that's about it, and they want to hire a bunch of script doctors to butcher the thing and turn it into something it's not, if you have the option, it's best to just keep walking. Otherwise, you'll end up being yet another greatest American hero. And don't be fooled by the great, that's not always a good thing. Every so often here on Versus the Network, I like to throw in a little story that shakes up the status quo. Something that's not just, the network is evil and the show didn't deserve to die. We've done this once before with My Name is Earl, and now here's another one that I've been wanting to do for quite some time. You all know Chowder, don't you?
You take the moon and you take the sun.
You take everything that seems like fun.
This weird little animated show that premiered on Cartoon Network in the late 2000s, created by C.H. Greenblatt, the one that spawned tons of memes, out of context clips, and blows up Twitter every so often. In my personal opinion, and according to my research, this just so happens to be the most common opinion, Chowder was a good show from beginning to end, asterisk. We'll touch on that in a moment, but right now, it's time to usher in Versus the Network number 307, What happens when a show getting screwed over might actually be a good thing? When Chowder first premiered on Cartoon Network, it was a decent hit, nothing spectacular or mind-blowing, but it was enough to warrant a second season. During this second season, the ratings started to dip, and they did so once again come season 3. While the ratings were going down, the cost of production was going up. Chowder was always an expensive cartoon to produce. What with all the animation techniques they'd use and live action or stop motion segments, it wasn't exactly a cost-effective show. Nevertheless, Cartoon Network decided to stick with it until about 2009. There, they got some cold feet. But it wasn't just because of Chowder specifically, it was actually because of something we covered a couple months before. Thanks to a mass advertiser boycott, Cartoon Network was starting to hemorrhage money. That and the negative press from the Boston bomb scare a couple years ago still hadn't quite gone away, so they were looking to reinvent their image as soon as possible, and according to them, the best way to reinvent Cartoon Network's image was to get rid of all the cartoons.
This is big brain time.
Here we are over 10 years later and it still doesn't make sense. Chowder could have survived based on its okay ratings and high cost of production for at least one more season, but since Cartoon Network was so trigger happy with making new live action shows, Chowder had no choice but to stop at season 3, accidentally creating a series finale in the process. Many people seem to believe that C.H. Greenblatt was given enough notice of Chowder's cancellation, so he was able to make Chowder Grows Up as the series finale. As it turns out, that wasn't the case. Chowder's cancellation was both swift and sudden. Greenblatt and his team didn't have enough time to prepare. Thankfully, they just so happened to have had this episode where Chowder grows up and sees how his life affects everybody else's. Though during the credits, it would all be revealed to be a dream. But who cares? The puppet segments are normally skipped over by Cartoon Network anyways, so the audience wouldn't really be the wiser. Also, quick side note, apparently Greenblatt wanted to have a Dragon Ball Z-esque time skip, as he calls it, where Chowder would take over the catering company, Schnitzel would work for Chowder and hate it, Mung keeps coming back to the kitchen trying to help Chowder out, but in actuality not being able to part with being the head chef. I'm sure it would have been entertaining, but it's giving me a lot of flashbacks to Jimmy Neutron Season 4 where it would have gotten darker and more story-focused. No thank you. Now, from the sounds of it, Cartoon Network did Chowder dirty. And yes, they absolutely did. It would have been one thing to cancel them because of the other two reasons I gave, but for the sake of putting things on like Destroy, Build, Destroy, Survive This, or the Other Siders? No! I mean, come on, Chowder's good, and those are, well, CN real. But according to C.H. Greenblatt, Chowder getting canceled when it did was a blessing in disguise. They were running out of ideas. While yes, the world of Chowder was surreal and had many possibilities for other crazy adventures, Greenblatt and his team were having a hard time finding out what they would be. They had already exhausted most of the plots they came up with before, and then for season 3, they went all out insane. Have you seen some of the episodes in season 3? And according to most fans, season 3 is easily the weakest in the show. It's louder, there's more fourth wall breaks,
Get that camera out of my face!
the jokes get lazier and more scatological, the characters are flanderized, and so on and so forth. I personally still like season 3, but yeah, compared to 1 and 2, it's definitely the weakest link. Chowder would not have improved if there was a season 4. In fact, you can expect it to get even louder, dumber, or grosser. Perhaps this is why Greenblatt might have wanted to introduce the time skip as early as he did, because otherwise, they couldn't keep the show afloat. And if you ask me, I don't think the time skip would have saved the show either. For one thing, that's a really big gamble to pull off right there. That could easily alienate the audience who's either not ready for that, not open to the idea, or who were turned off after season 3's decline in quality. And the second, and perhaps biggest reason why I don't think it would have saved the show is because nothing would change. Sure, some of the dynamics would be shifted, like having the naive Chowder be being the master instead of the apprentice, or this awkward, shy character being the apprentice instead of the wide-eyed innocent. But aside from that, and some of the ages changing of course, what's different? It's still the same world, the same setting, the same occupation for the main characters, the same situations, and the same style of writing. It's a lot like when the Fairly Odd Parents would introduce a brand new character every season, hoping that they'd be able to get a season's worth of episodes based around that alone. No matter how many times they tried the same tactic, it would never work. The character would burn out quickly, overstay their welcome, and as a result, they would get less and less focus as the season went on. Except for Chloe, she just never went away. And it got so bad once that one of their new characters, Sparky the dog, had to be erased from continuity because the fans hated him so much. And unlike, say, adding a new character to the lineup, the only way to undo a potentially disastrous time skip would be to go the Dallas route, where you unexpectedly make an entire season nothing but a dream. Fans just love those twists. I think we can all agree that, objectively, Chowder was screwed over by Cartoon Network. The motives behind it were nothing but shallow and poorly thought out. Cartoon Network didn't cancel the show because of any decline in quality or overall lack of interest. It was just because they had a knee-jerk reaction to some bad press and poor financial returns. So bam, the show had to pay the price. But I made this video mostly to tell people that when you look at the facts, there isn't much of a reason to be upset over Chowder getting the shaft. Would you have really wanted it to go on for 10, 11, 12 seasons where it gets louder and dumber and the characters get more unsympathetic? Or would you like it to be revived in this day and age where the people running the show are all too aware of its meme status and then completely saturate the show with nothing but that, thinking that those elements alone were the reason why the show was popular? Sometimes it's okay to say goodbye to a show that you love. Take my favorite show, for example, Dave the Barbarian. Am I angry with the way Disney treated it? Absolutely. Do I wish we would have gotten at least one more season? Of course I do. But I can also take solace in the fact that from beginning to end, it was an overall well-made, clever, and enjoyable show. Chowder, for the most part, can have the same effect. Sure, season 3 is a little bit divisive, but I don't think that there's many people who would say it's terrible or even really that bad. So maybe it's just me, but I'll take it. So what can you, the aspiring creator, learn from Chowder's situation? You can't stop the network from doing stupid stuff to you, of course. We've gone over that for many years at this point. But you can look on the bright side of things and maybe assess your situation to find that maybe this was the right thing to happen after all. And I'll leave you with this quote from C.H. Greenblatt saying exactly that. I didn't really think there'd be upsides to having a show canceled by Cartoon Network, but I'm feeling happier than I've been in a long time since we only got post-production. My schedule finally eased up. I haven't had a break like this in a long time. Chowder has opened awesome possibilities for me, and creatively, I'm feeling more inspired than ever. That's right, we're going back to PopeTown. I hope this is not a one-way ticket. As discussed previously on this channel, the controversial animated British sitcom from 2005 making fun of the Catholic Church isn't as awe-inspiring as the internet would have you believe. I myself am not a Catholic, I'm just Christian, so I'm not necessarily offended by the religious satire, quote-unquote. Personally, I just find it lame that they try so hard to be edgy and controversial or whatever buzzwords you could throw out. But we're not going to talk about that since, once again, that ground has already been tread. Today, we're going to be talking about Versus the Network number 307. What happens when the network faces a backlash that they really should have seen coming? Let's get into some background first. PopeTown was created by production company Channel X. One day, the people running that organization were thinking to themselves, what if we made an animated sitcom where it was an office setting and they had the dumb boss, the long-suffering coworkers, the corrupt people on top that are just trying to get rich, but instead of making it an office, why don't we make it take place in Vatican City? And thus, PopeTown was born. A pilot script called The Double was quickly written. It was passed around to various actors who, upon reading it, were excited to be involved with such a surrealist project, and we'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end.
Yeah, I mean, you can't say no to the Pope.
BBC Three picked PopeTown up, and they were excited about it because they felt it would add a new, bold direction for the channel. However, once they announced that PopeTown would be joining their lineup, Catholics around the world were enraged. Since the Pope was the leader of the Catholic Church, he's naturally held in some pretty high regard, so they weren't going to take this lying down. There were protests, online outrage, and just general discourse all throughout the Catholic community. Therefore, BBC Three had no choice but to kick PopeTown to the curb and pretend that the whole mess never happened. All of Channel X's work, all of the excitement that the actors felt about the project were all wasted. If it wasn't for Revolver Entertainment deciding to release the show in a cheap, shoddily made DVD, nobody in the UK would have ever seen it. PopeTown was banned in several countries, and it was aired very briefly in others, mostly just during shock and awe special events on things like MTV. And now it's been relegated to shock fodder. You know the type. Things that make up lists like the top 10 controversial animated shows you were never meant to see. And I bet you're all wondering, if PopeTown is the controversial entity, if that's what riled everybody up, why am I blaming BBC Three? That's because they should have known better. There were 3 distinct warning signs that PopeTown was going to be a disaster. So let's start off with the first and easiest, the subject matter. Do you really think that a show based around making fun of the Catholic Church, one of the largest religious institutions in the world, would have gone over well? No way. True Catholics take their religion very seriously, so when someone's gonna make fun of it, or try to cheapen it in a low-rate animated sitcom, they're not gonna stand for it. They're going to let their voices be heard. And as we can see by the outrage that transpired, it was enough to make BBC Three, at the time one of the largest channels in the United Kingdom, give into pressure and send PopeTown into the shadow realm. I don't feel bad for them because, well, what were they thinking? Did they really think they were going to get out of this unscathed? Or did they think that the Catholics of the world would just go, I don't think that's very cool. Oh well, I'll let it slide. Yeah, no, that was never a possibility. And if they ever thought it was, they were kidding themselves. Yes, I know, the religious aspect of PopeTown is very superficial and it doesn't really do anything beyond, hey look, it's the Pope! Let's all laugh! But that wouldn't matter, especially when not only had people not seen the show at the time, but BBC Three was implying that this would be this deep, cutting criticism of Catholicism, and as it turns out, it wasn't. Meaning that BBC Three made the outrage far worse than it could have been had they actually been honest about what PopeTown was. But what if I told you that the religious element to PopeTown was actually the most minor warning sign? A significantly bigger one would be the production company. Now, it's no secret that Channel X and I don't really get along. I've bashed them twice on this channel, and I'm gonna do it again. I'm sure they work really hard on their craft, but to be honest, I haven't seen anything of theirs that I've liked. Most of their material seems to be generic, by-the-numbers, lame adult humor where it's sex, violence, pop culture references, toilet humor. But instead of having jokes, it's simply including the subject matter and expecting that to get a laugh. Now, shows that include such material and have legitimate humor based around them, like South Park or Drawn Together, and hey, I'll even say it, early Family Guy, they have actual structure. They have legitimate laughs. This is just going into a middle school locker room and hearing people say dirty words and expecting that to be funny. Consistently going for the lowest common denominator was always the name of PopeTown's game. For instance, the reason that there's an American Pope, British helpers, and Japanese tourists is because they wanted to offend everybody all at once. Yeah, they really just cared about pushing people's buttons and nothing else, really. Though to be fair, they did somewhat anticipate the backlash they would get. In defense of the show, Ruby Wax, who regrettably voiced the Pope, would say that PopeTown doesn't feature any specific Pope. Instead, he was merely meant to make fun of the position of Pope rather than the person. The Pope himself had 2 inspirations, the first being the little niece of one of the creators, and the other being Eric Cartman. Oh boy, I think that explains the voice.
You bet, Father Sausage Face! I'm just full of energy!
And you will respect my authority.
And by the way, don't expect the South Park talk to stop here. It's a constant theme that branches all throughout Channel X's work. Let's do a little role play here. Pretend that you're the head of BBC 3. Representatives from Channel X come and pitch this dangerous, highly controversial show and are telling you it's going to be the next South Park. Now, as someone who knows Channel X's history, do you think this is ever going to go down well? I'll be devil's advocate here. Maybe this would be the right thing for them. Maybe making an animated sitcom in this strange, never-been-done concept before, at least in terms of just making fun of the Vatican, maybe this would be what helps them find their footing. They can't always strike out, they've got to have something good somewhere. That could have been the case, but the third point completely disproves it. The motive.
What a rich cretin.
The only reason Channel X wanted to make PopeTown was because they wanted to cash in on the success of South Park. And this goes beyond the whole every adult cartoon wants to be South Park trend for the late 90s and early 2000s. No. If you jump down that Channel X rabbit hole, you're gonna find that this goes way deeper than that. Ever since South Park first made it big, Channel X has been desperately trying to find their own version. We've actually covered one of them way back in the early days of Media Mementos. To all you new people out there, let this be your introduction into the unadulterated ugliness of Oregon's Wake. Oregon's Wake was originally an animated short made by two guys in a basement. Despite the fact that it's ugly as sin, it has some strong writing, a fun premise, and a lot of potential. Channel X thought the same thing. Only instead of them realizing that there's some potential in a show about a shy, awkward kid and his dangerous imaginary friend, they thought, hey, you know what? It looks kinda like South Park. It's adult like South Park. Maybe it can be South Park. Channel X reached out to the creators, they made a full series pilot, and it never got picked up. There are many reasons why, among which are the fact that it takes an interesting story, completely changes it and makes it boring, bloated, and generic. Everything somehow looks uglier than it did before. Some of the characters don't do anything, the humor suddenly becomes terrible, all the new stuff they add doesn't go anywhere. They took something that could have been a strong, if not short-lived series, and turned it into piping hot garbage, all for the sake of chasing that hype train. It got even worse with PopeTown. Every single press release, interview, public statement, they always compare this show to South Park. It's even on the DVD as well.
Imagine Father Ted meets South Park. You've never seen anything like it.
But had they gone with the original version of the show, it might have turned out okay. The reason that people like Ruby Wax or Matt Lucas decided to sign on to the show was because they found it interesting and strange. That's because the only episode script they had access to was the double. The double just so happens to be the episode that most people watch and then stop watching after that. But as a result, that doesn't give them a very good scope of what the show would become. It's a very laid back and subdued episode, and while it does poke some fun at the Catholic Church and a couple other institutions here and there, in terms of violence or poop jokes or anything like that, it's relatively quiet. Aside from the bizarre situations that the Pope or Father Nicholas would find themselves in, most of the humor is dialogue-based, something that the rest of the show would not keep. Even the two decent episodes, Career Opportunity and Day Trip, they also fall back on having raunchy subject material for the sake of having raunchy subject material.
It's Joseph Mengele.
Wow!
If you just read the script for the double, and you don't have things like the Pope's annoying voice,
Get me out of here, you bum crack!
or any of the strange animation choices Channel X would make,
It's one of my greatest achievements. Wario Land 4.
I could see how someone who doesn't really care how the Catholic Church would react would think this could go somewhere. It's a decent show with room to grow. Too bad that got stunted after episode 2. So with all that being said, I gotta say that PopeTown getting shelved was actually the best outcome it could have had. Because if it was allowed to air, And if for some reason the Catholics didn't care, it would have gotten some scathing reviews, BBC Three would have gotten a lot of blowback for having such a bad show be put on the air, and nobody would have won. The only reason PopeTown is remembered today is because of the controversy from when it was first announced. If that did not happen, nobody would care. And the reason I say that is because that's exactly what happened to the sequel series. Once PopeTown was shelved and the anger died down, BBC Three pulled Channel X into a meeting and basically promised them, we'll greenlight whatever you pitch to us next, just please don't get angry. Channel X decided to cash in that check with Snuffbox. It lasted only a couple episodes, everybody hated it, and it faded away, never to be spoken of again, until now. PopeTown would have met the same fate. And what do you think is worse? Having your show consistently being heralded as one of the most controversial things to ever exist? Or for nobody to remember or care about it whatsoever? I guess at the end of the day, the angry Catholics did PopeTown a service. But in all honesty, it never should have happened. BBC Three, considering the Catholic Church subject matter, the people making the show, and the motive behind it, it was never going to work. There was no outcome where PopeTown would have brought anything remotely positive to BBC Three. Keep in mind, unlike say, Heil Honey I'm Home, this didn't air on a channel with commercial breaks. BBC Three was owned by the government. They didn't have to appease advertisers or sponsors or anything like that. What was there to be gained from putting the show on the air? So with that being said, they should have either told Channel X no, or thought about it a little bit after saying yes, and then stopping production before it got too far. Because as it stands, considering how hard the DVD is to find and the fact that it wasn't in print for very long, I don't think Channel X has still seen a return on their PopeTown investment, meaning that, as I said before, everything was a giant waste. So how can you, the aspiring creator, benefit from this knowledge? Well, actually for once, I'm going to advise people that want to be network executives. Before you pick something up, please think about the ramifications it could have. Not every show pitched to you is going to make fun of a religious figure, but still, you have to consider the pros and cons. If this show failed, how big of a mess would it be? And if it's a success, how much could you stand to benefit? Yes, it sucks when a pilot you like or have worked on doesn't get picked up, but in the case of PopeTown, sometimes the network really should just say no. We've made it to the end of Versus the Network 2023, and hey look, we all survived. That's more than I could say for last year. This time on Versus the Network, we're going to be covering a, I wouldn't quite say network, but block at least, that for the most part is a pretty good place for shows to end up. Adult Swim is generally pretty flexible with what's allowed on their network, and they have some of the least compromised visions on TV right now, and it's been that way for quite some time.
Who killed Hannibal?
Nevertheless, it still has some dark moments in its past, some moments even being from the recent past. And they all have one common theme that can be boiled down to Versus the Network number 309. What happens when the network acts so erratically that you can't predict their next move? Adult Swim has done this for quite some time, and I've rounded up what I feel are the best examples of them just changing their minds out of nowhere and then screwing something over. Let's start off with the pilot, Welcome to Eltingville. This was based on a comic series called, well, Eltingville. The comic and the pilot revolve around 4 boys in a group called the Eltingville Club, and they geek out about things like comics, sci-fi, fantasy, and whatnot. While the premise sounds kinda mundane, it's a quite charming feature, and honestly, I could definitely see a series coming out of it.
Why can't somebody just put that little geek out of our misery?
At first, Adult Swim felt the same way. They were very hands-off during production, letting creator Evan Dorkin do basically whatever he wanted. Granted, it's not like Eltingville would really push the envelope, so to speak, but still, it was appreciated. Welcome to Eltingville aired with some strong ratings and a very good critical response. Despite this, Adult Swim randomly lost interest overnight, and nobody, not even Dorkin himself, knows what happened. Here's what Dorkin had to say about the situation. We still hear from folks asking why the pilot never became a series. We don't know what to tell them exactly. We never got an official explanation from the network as to why Eltingville didn't make the grade. We all just knew it wasn't happening and moved on. And that was the end of the Eltingville Club on television. Much like the whole Making Fiends fiasco, now that Adult Swim has aired the pilot, it's officially theirs. So putting Eltingville on another network would be nearly impossible, and since it's been over 10 years since this happened, Eltingville fans had better not hold their breath. Now here's one that doesn't get talked a lot about, which is strange considering the internet outrage it sparked. Welcome to the terrifying world of Neon Gnome. If this looks familiar to you, well, this is what became the Problem Solvers! Yep, Problem Solvers started out as an Adult Swim show. For 1/2 episodes, it's kind of unclear. More in terms of classification though, because officially there are 2 pilots to the Problem Solvers, Alfei and Neon Gnome. Alfei started off as this weird little Easter egg on a Paper Rad DVD, and this got Paper Rad all excited to make a brand new show featuring this character and some of his weird little friends. The people at Paper Rad cobbled this thing together and pitched it to Adult Swim. Adult Swim was interested at first, but then later decided that the art style was too cute to put on their network. Even though cute is probably the last thing that most people would use to describe the Problem Solvers' art style.
What the?
Okay. They clearly knew what the show was gonna look like. They knew that it was deranged and strange and that, like 12 Ounce Mouse, would have an art style so ugly that it would only cater to their up-and-coming stoner base. But no, they felt it would be better suited on Cartoon Network, and we all know the mess that came out of that, don't we?
Everything about this show is just terrible, and it should be a form of torture to watch.
Like, how does this even happen?
Hey, buddy, somebody knocked you out. Pee in this cup and I'll go throw urine in their face.
Who the hell are you?
Perhaps one of the most divisive shows on this list, Stroker and Hoop had a lot going for it at the time. Ratings were pretty good and the creators were all set for an even better second season. They've got a whole blog post about what they were planning on and yeah, seems pretty good. Adult Swim, however, decided to cancel the show with no warning, causing the season 1 cliffhanger episode to be the series finale.
No!
So if you didn't see the word of God, so to speak, and hear what the creators had in store for the next episode, you would just assume that the title characters are dead. Simple as that. The reason that Adult Swim gave was because the show was too expensive to make, and at first that might sound weird because it's made in Flash. One of the reasons why Flash became the tool of the future, at least at the time, was because it was simple and cheap to animate in. However, if you see the show, you can spot all the crazy detailed things they do with said Flash tool, so I can imagine that it's a pretty expensive show to make by Flash standards. But when it comes to expensive period, I'm not so sure. Sure, the episodes were a bit longer than most of their offerings, but Adult Swim was getting some serious traction around that time, meaning that they should be able to pitch in some more money for the show.
A good day, gentlemen.
Wait!
Especially considering that a lot of their other series at the time were either reusing assets or were cheaply animated due to a limited style choice. This one's kind of up in the air as to whether or not it got screwed, and while I certainly think that it was, it's not the worst one that we're gonna hear about on this list. So let's see what you think in the comments below. But only after you finish watching this video, of course. Those of you who are longtime fans of Media Mementos know that one of my favorite shows of all time is Moral Oral. And judging by the explosion of content based on the series as of late, I guess I'm not alone. I've covered this story once before, but hey, why not tell it again? When Moral Oral first came out, it was disguised as a silly, raunchy comedy that was a parody of Davey and Goliath. The creator, Dino Stamatopoulos, always intended for the show to get darker, focusing more on the characters and subject matter rather than,
Ha ha! Oral is drinking his urine!
Adult Swim was in full support of this, constantly urging the team to get darker and grittier and more real with the episodes as the series would progress. When it got to season 3, however, Adult Swim suddenly decided that Moral Oral was getting too dark for their network and shut production down, leaving several storylines unfinished, others being rushed, and leaving several stories that were planned for the future fully unproduced. The most notable being Arthur Puppington trying to reconcile with his family, Goth Oral, Shapey and Block becoming well-behaved children, and Miss Censordoll taking over the town. Thanks to Adult Swim, we'll never see these happen. To this day, I and the rest of the Moral Oral fandom are baffled that Adult Swim was constantly urging Dino to make the show darker, but then when he did, suddenly it became too dark and it was bumming everybody out, so now it had to go. Yes, the show did get pretty nasty, especially with episodes like Alone or Numb, but that's when the show was really starting to get good. Besides, Adult Swim should have known where the show was going. Did they not read the script for Nature before it came out? Did they not read any of the memos that the Moral Oral crew had passed around? Remember, Adult Swim, much like other blocks or networks, is not supposed to be left in the dark. They're supposed to check in every so often to make sure that things are okay. That's how Nickelodeon learned the hard way that the back of the Barnyard crew was giving them the middle finger, and that's how Adult Swim should have learned the direction that Moral Oral was going to take. If they had a problem with this, they should have stepped in midway through production and said, "Hey guys, this is a little, much. Do you mind toning it down, please?" Then they could have stopped the problem, quote-unquote, before it even happened, and Moral Oral would have, get this, gotten to finish everything. Wouldn't have that been great? Too bad that Adult Swim's opinion on things are decided by random coin flips every day. Sorry, Oral, guess you just got unlucky today. Next up, Icelandic Ultra Blue. Okay, wow. This one is so big, I could not fit it into this video. So instead, if you want to hear the story behind this mess, check out this video by Okay Fine Be That Way. It tells you the entire story front to back. And hey, I cameo in it, fake swears and all. What the heck? Really frick with people's heads. Calling someone a thief is a ship thing to say. Heck. Cheyenne Cinnamon and the fabulous unicorn of Sugar Town Candy Fudge is one of the strangest cases of, never mind, that I've ever seen a network pull off. In 2010, Adult Swim aired a bunch of pilots and asked the fans to vote on which one they would like to see become a series. Cheyenne Cinnamon won in a landslide, like not even close. People wanted to see more of it. Adult Swim, however, did not. Despite the fact that Cheyenne Cinnamon was the clear winner, it never got more than the pilot. Everyone was baffled. If Adult Swim was gonna ask the fans what they wanted to see, why did they not go with what the fans clearly demanded? It's like if for the yearly Christmas video that I let the audience choose the theme of, if you all voted for, say, the complete history of whatever happened to Robot Jones, I just decided to go, nah, I don't feel like it. I'm gonna do the complete history of Master of Disguise instead. Surely, though, Adult Swim picked the second place winner, right?
Pineapple. 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 Pineapple.
Actually, no. The show that got picked up instead was in a distant fourth place, Soul Quest Overdrive. This was a spin-off of Aqua Teen Hunger Force, featuring their Bible Fruit characters in name only, because in case you can't tell, a bowling pin and a basketball and the like, they're not fruits. I've learned that the hard way myself.
I'm just gonna go chill in the car.
I'm not even sure why this one was picked. To be honest, it's terrible. All Soul Quest Overdrive seems to be is the table scraps of what wasn't good enough to make it into Aqua Teen, and now it's all being acted out by less appealing characters with an uglier art style. If Adult Swim picked this over something that fans actually wanted to see, maybe they at least treated it well?
Wrong!
The series was cancelled after 6 episodes, with only 4 ever making it to air. The last 2 episodes are not only lost media, but they're complete enigmas. Nobody seems to know anything about them, not even the titles. All the episodes were aired on the same day at 4 o'clock in the morning.
Oh boy, 4 a.m.
That whole contest with the pilots being voted on by the fans, yeah, that was all a big waste, in every sense of the word. Metalocalypse was cancelled for the same reason as Stroker and Hoop, but unlike Stroker and Hoop, I have no trouble believing that this thing was too expensive to make. Look at this thing! It wasn't my personal favorite show, but it has a fiery and passionate fan base that would do anything to see the show come back. Adult Swim saw this and decided to have some fun. Adult Swim told the Metalocalypse fanbase that if they received 25 faxes to their office requesting that the show would come back, Adult Swim would make it happen. Needless to say, they got well over the 25 faxes they requested, but instead of a Metalocalypse revival, the fans were treated to a video of all their faxes going right into the trash. Now, maybe it's because I'm not that big of a fan of the show and never really got into it, but I kind of see this as on brand for Adult Swim. They do this kind of trolling stuff all the time. It's perfectly expected, but if you were a fan of the show who just could not accept that it was over, yeah, I can see you getting pretty mad at this.
You're all very important. To me. There.
Luckily, the revival movie came out not too long later, and yes, while this whole thing was clearly planned out from the beginning as a marketing stunt, it still fits all too well, albeit accidentally, into the narrative of Adult Swim changing their opinions like people change socks. Or at least like people should change socks. You know who you are. No show, no matter how successful, can ever be safe from Adult Swim's hot and cold mood swings. 1 minute you're great and you're one of the biggest shows they've ever had, and then the next, you end up like the Venture Brothers. I love this show, and I can't wait to see more of it. I can't believe I haven't marathoned the whole thing yet. It's really fantastic.
What are you, shy? Sasquatch doesn't have anything you haven't seen before.
Sasquatch is something I haven't seen before.
Adult Swim was one of its biggest cheerleaders right from the start. It was up there with Robot Chicken and reruns of Family Guy as one of their staple programs.
Whoa, this is trippy.
But then, out of nowhere, Adult Swim canceled the show with no warning. Fans and crew members alike were completely confused. How could it be possible that the Venture Brothers, of all things, could meet such a fate? Luckily, they did get the revival movie that wrapped the series up a little while later, but seriously? It's like Nickelodeon doing this to SpongeBob or the Fox Box doing this to Sonic X.
What were they thinking?
All's well that ends well, I suppose, since that finale movie went over rather well. Still would have preferred if they avoided this avenue altogether, though.
This is a threat against our very foundation.
And for the final story, it's one that I'm sure everyone's quite familiar with. Come and Learn with Pibby. The short revolves around Pibby and her friend Bun Bun getting glitched into this multiverse where there's all these different Hanna-Barbera, Cartoon Network, and Adult Swim characters, and the rest doesn't matter. I'm sure the only reason people would have watched is to see all these characters from other franchises interact, and on paper it sounds like a great idea, but in actuality, this would be both expensive and difficult to produce. What do I mean by difficult? Think of all the licensing red tape you'd have to cut through and all the deals you'd have to make. This would be one headache of a show, regardless of how big it would end up being. I don't fault Adult Swim for shutting the Pibby project down for that. But what I do fault them for is giving it the same treatment that they gave Moral Oral. They should have known. They should have never pursued this project, they should have never funded the pilot, and they never should have given it so much exposure when this whole time they knew that this could not be done. It's giving the creator, the crew, and the fans a bunch of false hope, stringing them along and getting them excited for something that could never be. The same thing happened, to a lesser extent of course, in 2006 with Korgoth of Barbaria, a popular pilot that Adult Swim announced was going to be a full series.
The Alchemist mentioned it would take several seasons for it to take effect.
Only to suddenly change their minds and announce in a bumper of all places that Korgoth would only get the one episode. Once again, this was due to budgetary reasons, and instead of negotiating maybe cheaper animation tactics or different studios or anything like that, Korgoth just died. Simple as that. That's great of you, Adult Swim. Truly
great.
Nothing wrong with a hard day's work.
Those are some of the biggest skeletons that Adult Swim has in their closet. And I bet you're wondering, if Adult Swim has done such bad things, especially to shows that I consider spectacular like Moral Oral or the Venture Brothers, why am I not putting them in the same camp as Nickelodeon as places you should never pitch your show to? That's because when Adult Swim does something like this, they try their best to make up for it. Neon Gnome was given to Cartoon Network instead, helping the Paper Rad people get their foot in the door for their pitch. Moral Oral, Venture Brothers, and Metalocalypse got revival specials, and the creators of Stroker and Hoop got to stay at Adult Swim, even though their show was over. The people at William Street clearly care about the fans and the producers of these shows. They don't take anything for granted. And of course, it's expected that every network makes their fair share of mistakes. And hey, some networks are mistakes. So why shouldn't Adult Swim be any different? I'm sure there's some more evil or nefarious examples of them screwing a show over, but these were the biggest ones I could find. And if this is as bad as it gets, I'd take Adult Swim over Nick or Disney Channel any day. So good job, Adult Swim, you don't suck. And what can you, the aspiring creator, learn from all this? The only thing I can think of is follow the old Boy Scout code of always be prepared. You never know when you'll be the biggest thing in the world and then just get cancelled out of the blue, will ya? The Icelandic Ultra Blue, if you will.